150 years ago today, Abraham Lincoln arrived at a cemetery in Gettysburg to give a speech. The occasion was the dedication of a military cemetery for the soldiers who had died in a bloody battle the previous July. President Lincoln's speech was not the keynote address. That honor had been given to Edward Everett, an accomplished statesman who was known as one of the great American orators in the Civil War era. Everett was also known for his long speeches. The nearly 2-hour dissertation he gave on November 19th in Soldiers National Cemetery was in sharp contrast to President Lincoln's 2-minute speech. The Gettysburg Address contains approximately 270 words. I said 270 because there's a couple different versions that go from, I think, 268 to 272 or 73 words. But there's a few competing versions. The vast majority of them have only one syllable. The speech is 10 sentences long. It has a simple, recognizable structure that was common for public speeches of the time and continues to serve as a model for speechwriters today. To commemorate the 150th anniversary of President Abraham Lincoln's best-known speech, we have invited members of Gettysburg High School's junior ROTC program here to deliver it to us. It's my pleasure to invite Kelsey Riley, Jack Tully, Dakota Peterson, Alex Fatah, Emma Baum, and Bryce Murray to the rostrum to recite the Gettysburg Address. Their advisor and coach is Colonel Michael Wirtz, who is sitting to the left of the rostrum.
Fourscore and 7 years ago,
our fathers brought forth on this continent
a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this.
But in a larger sense,
we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground.
The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated far above our poor power to add or detract.
The world
will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here.
It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced.
It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us.
That from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion.
That we here highly resolve that those dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom.
And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
There are some myths that have attached themselves to the Gettysburg Address over the years. One is that Lincoln jotted the speech down on the back of an envelope or on a wrapping paper as he rode on the train from Washington to Gettysburg. Today, we have with us Dr. Randall Miller, a professor of history at St. Joseph's University, to address some of the most popular misconceptions surrounding this famous speech. Dr. Miller has developed a national reputation as a commentator on a variety of issues. He speaks often on a wide array of historical subjects that include the Civil War and Reconstruction, national and regional politics and government, power and class in America, and the history of immigration. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books and recently completed a new book on Lincoln and leadership and another on the Northern home front during the Civil War. Dr. Miller is the former editor of the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography and the co-editor of Pennsylvania, A History of the Commonwealth. He is also former president of the Pennsylvania Historical Association and served as a Commonwealth Speaker for the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. It's now my pleasure to present to you Dr. Randall Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for a most generous introduction, and thank you all for the opportunity to give my own brief remarks on perhaps the most remarkable and certainly the most memorable speech in American history. There's an old axiom for anyone daring to say anything about the Gettysburg Address, namely, you should never talk longer than Lincoln's original, which was roughly 2 minutes in speaking time. Yikes. Mr. Smith, the Speaker of the House, has me on a tight leash, so I can't go too far beyond that standard. But being a college professor with a podium, it's hard not to blather on for more than 2 minutes about anything. We do that. And there's much to say about Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, as the large literature on the subject attests. On November 19, 1863, 150 years ago today, Lincoln gave a great and enduring speech because he was always aware of why he was giving it and to whom and for whom he was speaking. Lincoln did not give many speeches as president. He learned early on when he was en route to his inauguration in 1861 and gave extemporaneous speeches to please the crowds that his words really mattered and that his words could be easily and even purposely distorted. He became a very careful speechwriter thereafter. And he was very much so in drafting and delivering the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln also understood that to be effective, any speech must be aware of at least three factors: the occasion for the speech, the setting for the speech, and the audience for the speech. Lincoln kept all three factors in mind when he accepted the invitation to make a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of the new National Cemetery at Gettysburg, where the Union dead from the great three-day battle in July would be reinterred, and where the nation would not only claim and honor the dead, but also would obligate the living to remember why those men had fought and why the fight must continue. Stories of Lincoln's writing the speech abound, and much of the popular account is covered in myth. For the record, Lincoln did not dash off the speech in a moment of inspiration or scratch it out full while traveling to Gettysburg on a train from Washington. In fact, he thought hard about what he understood was to be a speech dedicating a cemetery, but also a political speech to rally further support for a war that already had taken over 250,000 lives and seemed stalled with no end in sight, and also to rally support for the new purpose of the war, namely that new birth of freedom promised in the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1863. It was, after all, to be a new nation, not an old union that now must come from the war. And significantly, Lincoln used the word nation 5 times in his speech, the first time a president used that and did not use the word union. Like all of Lincoln's speeches, Lincoln structured his speech with a look back to the past in order to assess the present and chart a future. While in Washington, Lincoln wrote out his famous opening of the speech: 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth in this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In doing so, he harked back to the Declaration of Independence as the people's lodestar, which for Lincoln it always was and must be. He had used the phrase once before in July 1863 and now did so again, both for its rhythmic cadence and biblical reference, which suffused his speech, and also to ground his thoughts in the fundamental truth and obligation of America, namely to fulfill the American Revolution's promise of securing liberty, which, by the way, Lincoln capitalized in his speech, the only word besides God. The speech ended with that dedication again. Lincoln continued the speech by noting why he and others were gathered at that Gettysburg cemetery that day. A mighty battle had been fought, and the nation needed to honor its dead. But Lincoln did not finish writing the speech while he was in Washington. There was other pressing business at hand, such as managing a war. He continued to think about the speech while he was still in Washington. That preparation, including asking the landscape gardener who had designed the grounds at Gettysburg Cemetery to review the layout, topography, and all with him, so he would know the nation's resting place even before going there. And he had to know the place to speak there, for the people. Lincoln returned to writing the speech after he settled into David Wills's house in Gettysburg the day before the dedication ceremony. Lincoln's journey to Gettysburg and time there profoundly affected his understanding of what he needed to say there. He saw part of the battlefield still scarred from the raging fight a few months earlier, the tombs of men to be reinterred at the cemetery, caskets at the train station, and the little town festooned in banners and flags in preparation for a great public celebration. Especially important, on the morning of the dedication, Lincoln toured the battlefield and visited the site where his friend, the gallant and brave General Reynolds, had been killed on the first day of the fight. Lincoln was deeply moved by the physical and emotional realities of the place and the memory, and he returned to the Wills house to revise his talk to be delivered later that same day. The revised speech now included a new second page that emphasized the purpose for the occasion and the setting, to dedicate the place, the soldiers, and the cause. He used the word dedicate 6 times in the speech he gave that day. He also underscored only one word for emphasis in delivering the speech. The only word so marked for emphasis was did, when he stated, "The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." Contemporary accounts of the speech note that when Lincoln spoke those words, some listeners wept. Lincoln was almost in tears himself at the ceremony. The day had begun with a solemn procession, hymns sung, prayers given, and then Edward Everett's majestic 2-hour recounting of the battle that did move the assembled throng to tears, and Everett's paean to the Union that brought cheers. All this affected the president too, so much so that while delivering his own accounting of the battle, burial, and burdens of history, Lincoln added, "under God," to his peroration. Those 2 words are not in Lincoln's drafts of the speech. They came from the moment and the emotions of the place, the day, the dedication. Interestingly, and perhaps providentially, by 2 o'clock, when Lincoln began his address, the sun had burned off the morning clouds, and a beautiful Indian summer day now shined down in the grounds. In examining the speech, it is significant that the first part was largely drafted in Washington and hardly revised thereafter. But the second part, as delivered, was different from the earlier drafts of the speech. As historian Martin Johnson has observed in his new book, Tracking the Writing Process, I'm quoting here, the experience of the town, the battlefield, the cemetery, and the ceremony, all that Gettysburg was and became for Lincoln, actually transformed his vision and became encoded in his speech. Indeed, the speech was a living document to its very moment of Lincoln reading it in its solemn, businesslike manner, as was his habit, with every word resonating with meaning and with the crowd listening raptly. The speech summed up why people needed to gather at the new cemetery and the battlefield. It was essential that they remember that men had died there. But more so, it was essential to give meaning to that sacrifice by understanding why they fought and gave the last full measure, and why the great task before the nation must be completed. The occasion, the setting, and the audience all came together in the speech as the president linked the Declaration of Independence and the obligations of the founding generation to the battle and the dedication and the obligations of the present and future generations. With that, Lincoln spoke not just for his time, but for all time, which means for our time. The Gettysburg Address in its 150th year still echoes loudly the promise to which we must rededicate ourselves. It has summed us for us, as for Lincoln and his generation, in the great peroration that explains everything. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Let it be so from this day forward. Thereby, we too will stand with Lincoln now and ever after. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. Of all the songs written during and about the Civil War, perhaps none is as strongly identified with the cause as the Battle Hymn of the Republic. I would now like to introduce the Cumberland Valley High School Ensemble under the direction of Carol Anderson to conclude our program by singing this patriotic song. For the information of the members, thank you very much. That was wonderful. We have one other resolution that we're going to consider on the uncontested calendar and have a few members that would like to speak pertaining to the 150th anniversary. So while that sort of concludes the official program, we have one resolution to kind of ties into this. Turn to today's uncontested House calendar and recognize the Majority Leader who calls up House Resolution 384, printers number 2107 on page 1 of the uncontested House calendar. House Resolution 540, printers number 2612. House Resolution 551, printers number 2641. House Resolution 556, printers number 2664 on page 2 of the uncontested House calendar. And House Resolution 561, printers number 2668 on page 3 of the uncontested House calendar. The clerk will read the resolutions.
House Resolution 384, introduced by Representative Reedshaw. House Resolution 540, introduced by Representative Hackett. House Resolution 551, introduced by Representative Cohen. House Resolution 556, introduced by Representative Dean. And House Resolution 561, introduced by Representative Brown.
Question is, will the House adopt the resolutions? Those in favor of the resolutions will vote aye. Those opposed, nay. The members will proceed to vote. Have all the members voted? Have all the members voted? Clerk will record the vote. On the resolutions, the ayes are 201, the nays 0. The resolutions are adopted. I'd like to recognize the lady from Montgomery County, Ms. Dean, and subsequently the gentleman from Adams County, Mr. Mull, under unanimous consent relative to the resolution just adopted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you for this beautiful program and all its talented participants. Like you, I rise today to remember the 150th anniversary of President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And I thank all of you for your enthusiastic support of Resolution 556, which remembers Lincoln's words. 150 years ago, Lincoln was asked to offer words to dedicate Soldiers' National Cemetery, not far from here in Gettysburg. And it is from that assignment of dedication that Lincoln gave all Americans this lasting gift. By this resolution, I invite you to re-examine the speech for its content and style. And like the good professor, I am mindful of how brief it is and that I must be as brief. Discover just what makes these 10 sentences and these 270 or so words so lasting. Part of its magic is its compact simplicity, its use of language. Notice that most of the words are a single syllable. Notice the elegant repetition of words, words like nation, devotion, consecrate, conceived, shall, and most notably, the 6 times Lincoln uses the word dedicate in various forms. Notice his graceful use of triplets, such as we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground, or a government of the people, by the people, for the people. But as beautiful as the words are, it is the content and clarity of argument that are more powerful. Lincoln was speaking about the war dead and demanding that their great sacrifice was not simply an act to preserve the Union, but through their sacrifice that the nation would be reborn. Lincoln saw in them, the dead and the living standing before him, what we search for in ourselves: dedication to a belief that all men are created equal, and dedication to the belief that through self-government and self-sacrifice, America can endure and be reborn. The other important speaker of the day spoke for 2 hours, nearly 13,000 windy words. How wise and humble of a president to understand that words matter less than acts. So in all we do here, I want to remember that humility. Let us rededicate ourselves to the ideals of self-governance, self-sacrifice, and equality. Again, I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Adams County, Mr. Mull is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I get started, and I can assure you I can't do mine in 2 minutes, I would be remiss if I did not say thank you once again to the Gettysburg Junior ROTC and to the Cumberland Valley High School Chorus. You certainly are the future of our country, and it is up to each and every one of us in this chamber to make sure that we leave this place a better place for you than what we found it. Yesterday, 150 years ago, Abraham Lincoln arrived in Gettysburg on a train and was met by several or hundreds of his followers, a friend of his by the name of David Wills, a local attorney in Gettysburg, where he would spend the night along with 37 other people hosted in his home. They made their way up the hill to the square of Gettysburg, where David Wills had his residence, as well as his law practice. They enjoyed an evening of camaraderie, companionship, maybe a libation or two, I'm not sure about that one. But that's where Lincoln decided to spend the night, on the second floor in a bedroom. Most of us who live in that area choose to believe that's where the Gettysburg Address was drafted. Some say it was finished there. None of us will really know for sure. But fast forward 145 years, till 5 years ago, when an organization called Main Street Gettysburg looked at the David Wills house and said, this thing is a landmark, and it is falling in disrepair. This is a very historical place. We have to do what we can to preserve it. They started a letter writing campaign, one of which was to yours truly. They needed to find help, not only from government, but from private funding. And they did. And they turned the David Wills house into an excellent museum, historical to the day, even to the point where all the mortar and all the bricks are painted. But during the reconstruction of the David Wills house, or refurbishment, if you will, some of the members of the Main Street Gettysburg Committee got together and said, we need to go find whatever period furniture and attire from that day we can find. Now, David Wills had died in 1894, and his estate was left to 4 daughters, of which scattered out. This committee found themselves in the state of Ohio, speaking to a descendant of David Wills, an elderly couple, if you will. And while they were sitting in their living room talking about what might still be available, that might still be in the family, they said they're really trying to get the bedroom back to the way it was. Do they know of or have pictures of maybe from that day or that period so that they could replicate it? And this elderly couple said, I think we can help you out. The committee said, gosh, we'd really like to see what the bed looked like. We need pictures of the bed. The elderly couple said, well, we can lend you the bed and the dresser. They said, what? Yeah, we still have the bed and the dresser. We have that. It's here. He said, you'd be willing to lend that to us? Well, sure we would. But then we'd have to find something else to sleep in. Needless to say, they have a brand new bedroom suit. Lincoln made his way to the cemetery 150 years ago today, followed by hundreds of people. And in his brief and historic speech, Lincoln told the assembled crowd that while few people would remember his words that day, They and future generations must never forget what occurred here. He paid tribute to those whose blood was shed on the battlefield so that the nation might live. In little more than 2 minutes, Lincoln eloquently stated the significance of their sacrifice and our responsibility to uphold and protect the ideals on which we collectively stand. Lincoln was in Gettysburg to honor the dead and dedicate their final resting place, but his message was for the living. For it was those who were left standing on that historic day, and all who came after, who bear the responsibility to ensure our democracy and the liberty it affords us are protected. Our nation is a work in progress. We must continue to strive for a more perfect nation, a more perfect union. It begins with each one of us here. It starts in this chamber. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker, thanks, gentlemen.